Hello, hello. Welcome to Rising. We have an excellent show planned for you today. Hello, Briahna.
Hello, Robby.
We're almost to that long weekend where we'll celebrate the 4th of July. So exciting.
I am excited. And this news cycle that we're about to talk about is a wonderful place to leave it for us, I think.
Excellent.
Let's get right into it. Well, as many of you are probably aware, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. participated in his first major cable news town hall last night on NewsNation, which, for the record, is a subsidiary of Nexstar, who owns The Hill. Kennedy took on a barrage of questions about his 2024 campaign, including about his skepticism about vaccines. Here is some of his answer.
You mentioned chickenpox. So when CDC was thinking of recommending this chickenpox vaccine as mandating for children, they did a study, and the scientist they hired to do that study was a scientist called Gary Goldman, a contract scientist. And he did the study in an isolated place in California called Antelope Valley, a long-term study. And what they find is if you give the chickenpox vaccine, mass vaccinate with chickenpox, it stops chickenpox, but it causes shingles epidemics later on, which are 20 times as deadly as chickenpox. So nevertheless, despite those studies, we mandated for American children in this country. In Europe, they don't. If you go to the British National Health Service website right now, you can read on that where they say, we do not recommend chickenpox vaccines because it causes shingles epidemics later on. And that's the problem. You can't just look at, you can say that this product is going to prevent this particular disease, but you have to look at the long-term impacts. Vaccines, like other medicines, have injuries that have long diagnostic horizons and long incubation periods that if you do not do long-term studies on them, placebo-controlled studies, comparing vaccinated populations to unvaccinated populations, you won't do it.
So I think we learned why there is some reluctance among folks, including the medical community, to have a frank, direct one-on-one conversation with RFK Jr. about some of these issues. And it's because he comes off as very persuasive. In that exchange, he had been asked a question by a medical doctor, a respectful question, but from someone who has concerns about whether or not RFK Jr.'s representations about some of his concerns about vaccine testing and the potential leaks between vaccine and other kinds of diseases are going to have the effect of discouraging people from taking especially early childhood vaccines that have had the effect of getting rid of many infectious diseases that used to kill a lot of people. And what you've discovered in the exchange is, first and foremost, many of the ways that the media represents what RFK Jr.'s beliefs are very far away from what RFK Jr. actually believes. So when you're face to face, you can no longer just characterize him abstractly as anti-vax because he says, I believe in vaccines, I am vaccinated, they have caused all of these benefits, et cetera, et cetera. Here are my discrete concerns. And then once you get to the more discrete concerns, like the exchange you saw there about the specific issue of the chickenpox vaccine, or the specific issue of Hep B vaccine, or a specific issue of the placebo-controlled trials. He's right about a lot of that stuff. Now, there are medical reasons. There are scientific reasons why, for example, there are some ethical concerns about whether or not you can do a placebo-controlled trial with the vaccines. In other words, if we know a vaccine prevents the spread of these childhood infections, is it ethical to not give them to large swaths of a population to see if the vaccine has these other kind of side effects? You're basically denying people protections against illnesses that are deadly.
Right, although you could study people who don't want to get the vaccine, who are making the choice not to get the vaccine. It can be done.
Sure, but some of these vaccines are just so universally applied at this point. That's a problem. And another problem with the placebo control issue is that, from RFK Jr.'s perspective, a lot of the controls have used the preservatives in the vaccine, but not the dead vaccine, the dead disease, basically the inactivated vaccine disease. And his argument is that it's some of the preservatives that are causing some of the problems. So from his perspective, those trials are not
I thought this issue was very well handled during that town hall. So Elizabeth Vargas asked him about his stance on vaccines, and then he clarified, well, what do you mean by that?
Right.
And then she let him talk for a very long period of time. He took that question from the audience member and then talked for a very long amount of time. And it's just as you said, what emerges is that he has this very well informed. Even if you disagree with it, it is well informed. He brings evidence. Like, I think people in the mainstream naively believe that if someone has a belief they think is fringe or kooky or out there, that makes them like an idiot or not, but it probably makes them very, like, partisan people are very well informed on all the arguments for and against their position. So even if you disagree with him, it was compelling. And what emerges again is that he has these concerns about how the makers of vaccines and their relationships to the American people has changed given changing laws and changing liability and the increasing power of the pharmaceutical industry over the regulators themselves. And he also said something which is what matters most to me. What matters most to me is not actually where he thinks the science of vaccines stand, because I'm not hiring him as my personal physician.
Right.
We are. If you were to vote for him, you are selecting him to be the chief policymaker of the United States. And I want a policy that it is in consultation between you and your doctors to decide what kind of medical treatments are right for you. That is not the position that many in government took. That is not the position that Joe Biden took when he ordered 80 million people to get vaccinated. And in fact, RFK Jr. said, he said those were, I think it should be your choice to do that. So that's what and if that's honest and that's true and that's being applied across the board to medical treatments and to other things, that is I think a compelling message that people are interested in hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I think
that it should be up to you.
I think folks' concern is that, like it or not, outside of the COVID vaccine issue, there have been the slate of early childhood vaccines which are similarly mandatory, at least if you want your kid to be able to go to school. And the concern, I think, some of the pushback against RFK Jr. is whether or not that kind of freedom of choice, which seems justified and validated in the COVID context, especially in what we know now about the COVID vaccine's inability to meaningfully disrupt transmission, is not necessarily the same for those other diseases. And does that your body, your choice kind of approach not necessarily hold up with respect to the childhood slate of vaccines? And do we still need to have largely mandated, at least for participation in school, those vaccines to prevent widespread illness, the likes of which we had in an earlier era? Now, RFK Jr., he didn't do this in the context of this debate, but he has also challenged some of the presumptions about the role that significant investments in childhood vaccination programs played in bringing down mortality rates for that slate of illnesses. He attributes much of the successes of the last 50 years or so, since the 1970s or so, to improvements in nutrition and antibiotics and things like that, which is something that some people push back on and dispute. But I would say you're right that the primary concern that he articulates is that there is capture of the regulatory agencies that are involved here, that there are liability shields via this National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which creates a pool for people who are vaccine injured to draw from, but which shields the companies from liability. And he's asking, I think, some pretty reasonable questions about what incentives that creates, not just for the safety of the vaccines we have, but testing future vaccines going forward. You know, is there as robust a safety mechanism in continued testing when people raise various concerns down the line, as there would be if the companies were actually liable for harms that were caused by their products? Right.
And he says, I don't trust the FDA. I don't trust some of these authorities. And I don't trust them either. A lot of the American people don't trust them. I don't trust them because they have approved defective and harmful products, and they've also stonewalled and not approved things that I think that have been approved in Europe that they're taking too long on for various reasons. He points to Europe having different. Our peer countries in Europe. These are not crazy places. These are places that come from the Enlightenment and science and a similar legal and philosophical tradition that have made different decisions, even with respect to the COVID vaccines. In Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, making somewhat different choices, not wildly different choices, but saying
vaccine even specifically.
Right, and that too.
Right.
So you're not. But again, this shows what a benefit there would be to a real debate between someone, again, because we're like Elizabeth Vargas, we're journalists. We don't have the precise knowledge, medical knowledge that RFK Jr. does have as someone who litigated and was involved from an activist standpoint. And he says, these studies have not been done that would verify the safety to my content. If a Dr. Peter Hotez type person says, yes, these studies have been done, it is safe, here they are, but we need that person to actually have that argument, because I don't know,
I did this,
and that would be so beneficial.
100%, and I did exactly this in a conversation I had with Dr. Vijay Prasad, who's an epidemiologist, today on my podcast, and I came to him thinking, well, there's going to be balls and strikes called here, and so he's going to be right about some things and wrong about some things. And I think because of the more nuanced posture that RFK Jr. has taken on some of these issues, it's less that he's wrong about much. He has said some things that I think are disprovable about the efficacy, the proven efficacy, which he, I think, overstates a little bit of some of the COVID drugs like Ivermectin, et cetera. He's right that they're not horse dewormers, et cetera.
Sure.
But he has overstated, I think, how useful they are in treatment. But outside of that, mostly his posture is, I just think there needs to be more testing. I think the pharmaceutical industries are held to a lighter standard than other industries. I think there's perverse incentives that are caused by some of these liability shields. And it's very difficult to disagree with any of that, especially when he's right that the pharmaceutical companies have had lower obligations with respect to testing compared to with vaccines compared to some other kinds of drugs.
All right. Well, we're going to talk more about this debate, town hall event rather, that was on NewsNation last night in our next segment. So more Rising right after this.